Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It's a great privilege this afternoon to welcome a speaker who's actually new to the Faraday Institute, not new to many of us personally, but certainly new to the Faraday Institute summer course, and that's Professor Ted Peters, who is Professor of Systematic Theology at the Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, and is also at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, in California. And Ted is very well known for his writings in the area of bioethics. He's written widely in this area, in the area of evolution as well, and also is the co-editor of a well-known journal on science and religion as well, called Science and Religion, and so he's also very much involved in that as well. So we're very grateful to him for coming all this way from California, and he's going to speak to us this afternoon on Astro-Ethics and the search for life. So thanks very much, Ted.
Well, thank you, Dennis and Rodney, and for this stunning program. This is my first visit to the Faraday Institute, and we've had two really good days. Good bread and butter science and theology days. And it's also my first time in Cambridge. I've been many times to that other place here in the UK, but my first time in Cambridge, so that's a privilege. Our topic is Astro-Ethics and the search for life. I come from Berkeley, California, a city that's actually named after somebody in the UK. Does anybody know who that person is? Bishop Berkeley, a divine in the Church of England, who thought that America should be the place where science and religion would flourish. And the city of Berkeley, the University of California at Berkeley, was founded by two men of the clergy who were inspired by Bishop Berkeley, and hence we have that particular name. I teach at the Graduate Theological Union, and we have a research center called the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences. And this is our journal, and we have here the Golden Gate Bridge under construction in 1935. We like to think of our mission in terms of the creative mutual interaction between theology on the one hand and science on the other. We would like to see that bridge completed and have traffic going both ways, from science to religion, religion to science. It's not easy. But that is what our goal is. What I would like to do today is start with an area of science and do some theological, but actually more ethical reflection. And the area is going to be astrobiology. Astrobiology is a field that you can find in various parts of the world. In America, it's led by NASA, and they have published repeatedly over the last 10 years what they call a roadmap, which is the research agenda. And there are three key items on this agenda, and that is to find the origin of life. Secondly, to search for a second genesis of life, either here on this planet or on other off-Earth planets or locations. And then to take up the issue of expanding life from Earth to other bodies in space. This question about the second genesis of life is kind of interesting, and those of you who read journals such as Nature and Science know we have a controversy about Mono Lake in Southern California, where the claim is made that we found a life form that is different from the other life forms on our planet. We've tentatively assumed that life began once on Earth, and that because of the way our DNA functions, that all of us are related to that single origin. But could there be a life form that, instead of relying upon those six chemicals, that instead of phosphorus, it can live on arsenic, Could there be a second genesis of life right here on Earth? That's the question. Well, Paul Davies, who is one of the scientists on this team, wants to argue if it shows that there is a second genesis of life here on Earth, then that increases the probability or likelihood that there would be a second genesis of life on another planet in the universe. Currently, this is a very controversial study, and critics are saying the evidence is either botched or poorly interpreted, and we don't know yet how it's going to turn out. The field that I like, or the term I like to use to describe my field is astrotheology. I think I coined the term, but I'm not the only one who uses the term astrotheology, and I define it as theological speculations on extraterrestrial life. I think speculation is a good word. We use it quite a bit in the pursuit of knowledge. The only caution is don't believe what you speculate on until you can get some confirmation. If I were to set out an astrotheological agenda, the kinds of research questions I would raise is, what is the scope of God's creation? What I find curious is that both in traditional Orthodox theology as well as contemporary schools of theological thought, the assumption is always made that the creation has to do with planet Earth. Doesn't matter whether you're a feminist theologian or a liberation theologian or this kind of theologian or that, the scope has to do with this planet. But once you begin to look at the planet from space, you see that Earth is one tiny little blue dot, as Carl Sagan once called it, sitting in a very large arena. And theologically, do we think of Earth as the scope of God's business as creator, or do we think of the cosmos? Will extraterrestrial intelligent life be salvific or sinful? They might say, oh, that's a silly question. It's not a silly question, as I'll show later, that when we look carefully at the assumptions of the astrobiologists, they have a built-in doctrine that science saves. And that's always a good question for a theologian to think about. What about multiple incarnations? Actually, this question has been debated for 800 years in Christian theology, and that is, if there is life in other worlds, would the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ in this world suffice either as revelation or salvation for intelligent beings in other worlds, or would God manifest the divine self multiple times in different civilizations? Karl Rahner would be a recent Roman Catholic theologian who would say multiple incarnations, or Paul Tillich would be a Protestant theologian, multiple incarnations. Wolfhard Pannenberg, a Lutheran theologian, no, one creation is enough. One incarnation is enough, and that debate goes on. Let me just back up. Well, one more question is, what will happen to human dignity? And I will touch on this slightly in the event that we interact with intelligent beings who are superior to us in one fashion or another. This raises the theological question, why is it that we believe in the imago Dei, or the image of God, in the human race? And if there is some quality that we have, such as the ability to reason, curiously enough, you'll find that in medieval Roman Catholic theology, you'll find it in the secular Enlightenment, that that's the quality that distinguishes the human being. And if you believe that's why God treats us as belonging in the divine image, and if we meet them and their ability to reason is superior to ours, will we lose our status, and will we lose our dignity? What is the reason that we affirm human dignity in the first place? I just want to say These are the kinds of questions that should be on the agenda of an astrotheologian, and I'm not going to talk about them today. Here is today's agenda, Astro-Ethics, and I would like to break it down into three subcategories. First, planetary protection. Secondly, ethics having to do with extraterrestrial non-intelligent life. And then thirdly, and I'd like to spend most time here, ethics having to do with extraterrestrial intelligent life. Planetary protection. By the way, the framework here is to come from the direction of a theologian who thinks about ethical issues that have implications for public policy. That's my direction. We are in a situation currently where space researchers are raising these ethical issues. And I'll say more about why the ethical questions are being generated from within the astrobiological community. But the net result here will have to do with questions of public policy. So how can a theologically oriented scholar contribute to public policy wherein really the secular framework dominates? Planetary protection. We have 3,000 dead satellites orbiting our planet. Many of them have broken into fragments. And they're just floating around in orbit around our planet. We have cluttered our planet with space junk, so much so that if you do want to fire a rocket, you have to be very careful that you don't get hit by our own trash on the way out of Earth's atmosphere. And the amount of space junk is only going to increase. Is it not a moral issue to ask, why weren't the people who sent those satellites up in the first place financially responsible for getting rid of them once they got up there? Why is it that you get a free ride to use orbits in space as you're trashed up? And what is going to happen in the future with that? Well, that's just one kind of issue that public policies makers need to think about. A little bit more specifically, it may interest you to know that currently, internationally, the only treaty we have on which we have a working basis goes back to 1967 in the United Nations. And the particular, I'm not going to read this entire text, but I will want to pick up on a couple of features. The context here is pursuing studies. That is to say, we're talking about the scientists, all right? And what this leads to is the planetary protection policy having to do with two forms of contamination. When we leave planet Earth and we go to a body in space, are we going to contaminate that environment? It might interest you to know, if you don't already know, that of all the landing devices we placed on planet Mars, only one was sterilized. It is very possible that some microbes from Earth have hitchhiked to Mars and actually have integrated themselves into the Mars environment. Oh, what's the problem with that? Well, if you're an astrobiologist, here's the problem. You go looking for life on Mars and you find it. And curiously enough, it looks just like life back on Earth. Backward contamination has to do with what's going to happen when we find artifacts in space and we bring them to Earth, especially a microbe. Could that microbe let loose a disease that we wouldn't be able to combat? So we've got forward and backward contamination to deal with. This woman here is Margaret Ray. She's one of the colleagues that I work most closely with at SETI. And SETI, if you don't know, it stands for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence Institute. Let me turn then to the search for non-intelligent life, which describes basically what's happening within our own solar system. The search for microbial life, it's pretty well a foregone conclusion. We're not going to find intelligent life within our solar system. So the search for intelligent life has to do with the Milky Way galaxy and not our solar system. I see that some of my PowerPoint is not translating here. A year ago at Princeton, we held a working conference sponsored by COSPAR, the Committee on Space Research at the United Nations, NASA from America, the European Space Agency, and raised this question. Are biotic or prebiotic environments on other heavenly bodies, do they have intrinsic value? Now note what's going on there. Ecologists here on Earth want to argue that there are certain ecosystems that have an intrinsic value, and therefore, kind of like human dignity, we have a moral obligation to protect them. Should we treat the surface of Mars as having an intrinsic value or not? Well, what's the alternative? Well, the alternative would be is we could make it commercial real estate. It wouldn't have intrinsic value. Well, what I found interesting was that scientists sort of had an intuition like maybe it does have intrinsic value, but they couldn't really provide a philosophical justification for that. And as it turns out, and I'll say more about this in a couple of minutes, the idea of intrinsic value serves the interests of the scientific community who wants to do research. Well, whose interest does this violate? Well, it violates the interests of commercial enterprises. So, in a moment, I'll talk about an issue behind the issue. Another aspect of the astrobiological agenda or roadmap is the transportation of life from Earth elsewhere. And right now, the #1 candidate is Mars. And this is Chris McKay at NASA. And he's the architect of a plan to terraform Mars. Well, as you're probably aware, you and I breathe oxygen on this planet, and we exhale carbon dioxide and things of that particular nature. The planet Earth didn't originally have a supply of oxygen for us to breathe. We had to have 2 billion years of the development of life forms that gave off oxygen before an atmosphere could be created where you and I, or our ancestors, as oxygen-breathing sentient beings, could evolve. Could we deliberately create such an atmosphere on Mars? Could we deliberately plant on Mars organisms that would create an atmosphere of oxygen, and then once the atmosphere is there, we could move there? Well, that's Chris's plan. He thinks he can do it in 100 years. That's all it would take, 100 years. And we could create a living situation on Mars that will look a lot like it is here on Earth. Well, what are the ethical issues? Well, Chris says, I've got a #1 premise, and here it is: life is better than non-life. Well, if you agree to that, and then you go to Mars and you don't find life, then wouldn't there be at least a moral opportunity, if not a moral obligation, to transfer life from Earth to Mars and create a second living planet in our solar system? I want to say that's the kind of logic that you're going to get. Now, I just want to mention that Chris is a scientist who works on a government salary, which isn't very large, and Chris has got a lot of big ideas, and Chris represents the scientific community. There are others, however. I'm just holding up the sign. I'm not a member of the Mars Society. I was invited to talk with them about ethics on one occasion, so I borrowed a poster. The Mars Society plans on going to Mars, and Mars Society, are there any members of the Mars Society here? None? Okay, I'm an expert then. Okay, if you're a member of the Mars Society, you're going to believe certain things. First, you're going to believe that governments are inept, and that private enterprise can do things better than governments, especially science and technology. Number two, your plan is to colonize Mars and make it an economically viable settlement on Mars, which will produce wealth. Third, establish the next generation, so to speak, of our species that will live permanently on Mars. Now, what both Chris McKay and the Mars Society have in common, and they mutually influence one another, is that they want to establish a laboratory on Mars, a great big bubble, within which human researchers will be working for a period of time to get the terraforming process going. And in order to do that, we have to put a laboratory on the moon so that we learn to understand how life in hostile environments can work. So that's a 50-year process, laboratory on the moon, laboratory on Mars, before you can begin the colonization. But if you have a really good idea on how to do this, the Mars Society gives an annual prize to the engineer who advances the progress towards doing this. Okay, now what I think is the hidden agenda, just between you and me, is that private enterprise, with the economic boom that we had for a period of time, it's got so much money and so much creativity, and they're looking for ways to make profits off space, that the scientific community is shaking in its boots because they want to put a laboratory on the moon, and people like this are going to put tour buses on the moon. And the scientists won't be able to do their work. So, after 40 years, let's hurry up and get some ethics in place. Do I sound a little cynical? At any rate. Okay, this is the first ship. Let's turn now to extraterrestrial intelligent life, because I think the issues get a good deal more complicated here and a good deal more speculative. And in some ways I want to say, maybe we can assume this day is coming, maybe not tomorrow or day after, but when that day comes, will we have done some ethical preparation and raise questions if we're going to interact with intelligent beings in other parts of the universe. How should we treat them? How should we treat planet Earth in relationship to extraterrestrial civilizations? First of all, what are we talking about with regard to knowledge? SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, has been in existence now for about 50 years. Frank Drake, who is pretty much the founder, godfather, although he certainly wasn't alone for founding SETI 50 years ago, began this process of listening for radio waves that might be coming from technological civilizations elsewhere within the Milky Way. For those of you who watch the news, the Allen array of listening devices has just been shut down because of a lack of funds. Believe it or not, Californians are poor these days. But the whole project of listening for signals in outer space continues to go on. It has gone on in 50 years. In 50 years, as of right now, no single intelligent signal has been received. But SETI researchers continue with their enthusiasm in pursuing it. What about the ethics? Believe it or not, SETI people don't have ethics. Well, I didn't mean it that way, did I? What they don't have is a large, complex ethical scheme for dealing with what we're talking about. What they do have is a procedure that would kick in once the first signal from an intelligent civilization is heard. Namely, they would do things such as embargo the information for a short period of time until the global scientific community can be informed, until the proper heads of states can be informed. What scares a SETI researcher is that the technology for communicating is so local and so widely known that you might set up a transmitter in your garage and start communicating back with this civilization. So one of the unanswered questions is, do we answer? And if we do answer, who has the authority to say what? These are as yet unanswered, but I think rather interesting questions. There's far more excitement now about ETI than there was just a few years ago because of the rapid discovery of exoplanets, planets circling, orbiting stars within the Milky Way. George Coyne of the Vatican Observatory estimates 10 to the 17th power of planets within the Milky Way, within the universe that could host life. Carl Sagan used to say there are 1 million planets within the Milky Way that have life like ours. He had no empirical proof, but he just thought statistically that that's the way we ought to think about it. But these days now, the idea that there are planets orbiting stars like the sun is now a fact. It's indisputable, and it looks like we're going to learn more and more about this at a rather rapid rate. One of the ways that exoplanets are discovered, interestingly enough, is to just watch for a dark spot crossing a star. And with the Hubble telescope now, those things can be seen in ways that they couldn't before. The traditional way is to look for wobbles, and that could indicate a gravitational pull by an orbiting planet. Up until recently, the technology for searching for exoplanets has been limited to finding only very large Jupiter-sized planets. What we really want to find is the Goldilocks planet, a planet roughly our size, roughly our temperature, not too hot, not too cold, just right, so that we can have life. And the technology is getting such that the Goldilocks planets will soon be subject to discovery. All right, now, as a theologian and an ethicist, I would like to look at the assumptions with which the scientists work. Not just the results, not just the wonderful dreams and the grand visions, but what are the assumptions? Here's one. The principle of mediocrity. We actually heard about this a little bit earlier today in discussion of fine-tuning. The principle of mediocrity says that the physical and chemical processes that go on Earth go on here on Earth go on everywhere. There's nothing unique about us. We can expect to find the same physics everywhere in the universe. Okay, that's the first assumption. Second, this is a biggie. Cosmic evolution. Pause for a minute. The word evolution, in its dominant form since 1859, has referred to biology. Life evolves, and species evolve out of predecessor species. Okay? Cosmic evolution is what? The principles of biological evolution now applied to physics? over time leads to life. Wait a minute, is life part of the theory of evolution? Certainly not in the Darwinian tradition. Darwin's book was not called The Origin of Life. It was called The Origin of Species. And he says 3 or 4 times in the book, I have no idea how life began. Evolution refers to the development of species. Now here we are, a century and a half after Darwin's book, and the question of how life originated, we still don't know the answer for that. So watch what's happening now in this assumption. Evolution includes the movement from non-life to life. Okay? Then, once we have life, it evolves towards intelligence, and intelligence eventually to technology. I just want to say, this is an assumption, and it is a whopper of an assumption. Is it part of empirical, is it a conclusion drawn from empirical evidence? Well, it's disputable, and I'll get back to that in a moment. So here's one of my favorite guys, Chris Impey. He heads the astrobiology department at University of Arizona. Since we've only just attained, we have just attained the capability of space travel and communication, any civilization we encounter is likely to be far more advanced than we are. Note what's going on with that assumption. That if there is such a thing as cosmic evolution, and if it produces life, and if it produces intelligence, and if it produces technology, you give it more time, and it's going to be more advanced than we are. And if you can imagine how much we have progressed in technology in just the last couple centuries, give a civilization another 1,000 years, another 100,000 years, another 1,000,000 years, and think of how advanced they're going to be. I submit there's nothing scientific about that at all. It is a gross assumption. But unless you make an assumption like that, you're not going to have any reason to do this research. So what we have here is the doctrine of progress that we know from technology has been imported to the biology and to the physics at the level of the assumption that justifies the research. Does that mean it's false? No. Assumptions can sometimes be true. But you just recognize an assumption when it's an assumption and not think it's a conclusion. The third assumption that is made by the astrobiologists is that the contact optimists are right. Christian de Duve, Nobel Prize winning biologist says there are lots of planets out there just teeming with life. But that's really the minority view. The dominant view that you're going to find amongst evolutionary biologists is that what happened here on Earth is really a unique product of a number of chance occurrences. So here's Francisco Ayala, evolutionary biologist, former president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Here's a long paragraph. I won't read it to you, but he's saying, you're nuts. Why? Because what produced the human race and our intelligence is a product of so many chance occurrences over the long evolutionary history, it could not be repeated. Ernst Mayr, Stephen Jay Gould, and others have held this position. So if you want to make the assumption for the purpose of your research that physics leads to life, life leads to an evolutionary path that is progressive towards intelligence and technology, you've got leading evolutionary biologists who are saying that assumption ain't going to fly. Okay? I just want to show the status of the assumptions at work amongst the astrobiologists. One of my favorites is Enrico Fermi and the Fermi paradox. Anybody ever heard about the Fermi paradox? Yeah. Good. I don't actually understand it. Maybe you can explain it. But at any rate, the story as I get it, Fermi is sitting having a cup of Starbucks. No, that's false already, right? Fermi is having a cup of coffee in 1950 at Los Alamos, and he's reading maybe the New York Times, And there are two kinds of stories. One kind of story is that there are trash cans missing in New York City. And then there's another kind of story, there are UFO sightings. And then some cartoonist goes and puts them together, and it's the aliens who are stealing the New York City trash cans. So this leads Fermi to thinking, wait a minute, let's think about the stars and the planets. There are so many stars and so many possibilities for planets, and let's do some calculations. Where the heck are they? The universe should be teeming with life, and there is zero sign. At any rate, so the Fermi paradox kind of haunts people who are in this business. Is that a fair rendering, do you think, of the Fermi paradox?
Yeah, I can tell you more a little bit later if you like.
Okay, great.
Sure.
Good. Maybe during our discussion.
Yeah.
Thanks. Assumption number 4, and this is basically common sense, that contact with extraterrestrial intelligence will lead to some sort of interaction. Now, this is not an easy one. If SETI is successful and they hear a signal from an intelligent civilization that is 100 light years away, say, aha, they're there. Let's send them a signal at the speed of light. Well, you've got 100 years now before they're even going to know that we're responding, and this generation of scientists will be long gone. So the difficulties of carrying on an interaction, at least from the point of view of many SETI people, is we're never really going to be sitting down at a coffee table sharing coffee with ETI, even if there is interaction. Now the UFO community, on the other hand, want to say, well, they're already here. This is Stanton Friedman, spokesperson for UFOs. He doesn't like SETI. He thinks you SETI people, you make things really complex, whereas we've got plenty of visitors already in what he calls our extraterrestrial neighborhood. And Friedman used to really get upset with Carl Sagan, who would say, there are a million civilizations out there, but they're not visiting us. At any rate, I'm not going to resolve that particular debate here, but what I would like to do is work with assumption number 4 and say, yes, there will come a day in which we will have interaction with extraterrestrial intelligence, and now let's try to map out how we might want to think about it ethically. For lack of a better term, I'm going to call my view here responsibility ethics, actually proleptic responsibility ethics, and I have a bit of a dilemma. On the one hand, as a Christian theologian, I have theological grounding for my ethics, and I believe we should ground our ethics in our vision of God's new creation. I call it proleptic ethics because we want to anticipate a healed, redeemed creation, and that should guide our ethics. On the other hand, when you're dealing with public policy, you have to deal with things that are intuitively rational, so you can judge whether or not I've got enough to go on. 4 principles in order to make a so-called fitting response. One is, what is the comprehensive vision of the future that we seek? I'm going to assume that if we have an interaction with extraterrestrial intelligent beings, I think we would like to make it peaceful instead of warlike. Secondly, what is going on right now in our context? Well, that could refer to our geopolitical situation in which we really cannot get nations or other groups of people to cooperate on very much. Yet, when our planet faces an interaction with an extraterrestrial civilization, we're going to be treated like a unit. Is there any way that we can think of a single planetary way of dealing ethically with such a situation? Then, as theologians, we're concerned about human nature. What is human nature? What have we learned over the centuries about human nature, and what can we predict about us when it comes to dealing with aliens? So, in light of those things, what actions would be fitting in the present situation? And you've already heard me. I think we ought to think ahead, think proleptically, try to anticipate what's happening, and at least have some idea of what is better and what is worse. Then finally, as part of this thinking, ask the question, who belongs to our moral community? With whom and for whom do we make moral decisions? Is it only our compatriots here on Earth, or would extraterrestrial intelligent beings be part of our moral community? I'm going to say that the latter ought to be the case. In fact, we might even think of moral solidarity with an extraterrestrial community. Okay, it's with these in mind now that I want to take a look at the different scenarios that we might confront. Amongst the scientific community and in the popular mind, the number one criterion seems to be intelligence. It's an assumption. So, if we're going to distinguish intelligent aliens from non-intelligent, we have to have some criteria. One would be the technology test. If they have technology, they're intelligent, and that's the criterion used by SETI. Aliens who have technology that can create radio signals, they're intelligent. Okay. The Turing test isn't bad. This is one that is applied to computer situations. And basically it says if you interact with a computer, and if that computer seems intelligent to you, well, it is. Well, up until this time, no computer has actually passed the Turing test. I like the naming test. I think of Adam and Eve being asked by God in Genesis 2 and 3 to name the animals. Now, Karen and I have 2 cats, and we've named them Fluffy and Kitty. As far as I know, they have not named us, unless our names are Meow and Meow. So the namer, that is to say, those who have the ability to name, probably are more intelligent than the others. This is really embarrassing. I forgot your name. Okay. In light of the concept of evolving intelligence, what constitutes the potential moral communities? And I see three possibilities. One, extraterrestrial communities of sentient beings who are intelligent but inferior to us. Secondly, an extraterrestrial community which is roughly of the same level of intelligence as we are. And then there would be 2 subcategories. Are they hostile to us, or are they going to be peaceful towards us? And our moral fittingness would have to respect whether they're peaceful or hostile. Third, a possibility of an extraterrestrial civilization of sentient beings more intelligent than we are, superior to us in ways that we recognize. Then we would have to discern, are they hostile, are they peaceful, or do they represent salvation for us? Again, you may say, why is Ted asking that question? Well, I think you'll see in a couple of minutes, because it's already being asked in the so-called scientific community. Okay, responsibility ethics for extraterrestrial intelligent beings who are less intelligent than we are. Well, what have we learned about our relationship to animals on our planet? Well, we have a kind of schizoid relationship to animals. On the one hand, we exploit them, we hunt them and kill them, we raise them for food, we make horses and other animals work, etc. They are basically things to be sacrificed for human well-being. On the other hand, there's a part of us that loves animals and imputes to them value that makes us want to love them and care for them, and in some cases defend their rights over against human exploitation. And we have a hard time getting that one straight. Could we forecast that our disposition towards less intelligent extraterrestrials might be parallel, and we might have to get our act together as to what constitutes exploitation and what constitutes care. If we already have trouble with that on Earth, we may have some difficulty with that, but at least we don't have to worry about them eating us, maybe. Okay, let's move to a little bit more complicated scenario, and that would be peer ETI, those who are roughly as smart as we are. And if they're hostile, if they're going to be shooting at us, then what is our responsibility for defending us? Can we exploit them in the middle of battle? I mean, if they're clever in some ways, we might be clever in others. What about the issue of dignity? In the last couple of centuries, we've really fought hard over that one to impute dignity to each and every person, whether they're in our army or in the enemy's army. One of the things you'll notice about rhetoric when you're ready to go to war, the first thing you do is you strip the enemy, verbally strip the enemy of its dignity. That justifies killing them. Would we feel the ethical desire or impulse or obligation to treat peer ETI who are hostile to us with dignity, which I define clearly as treating a person with dignity as an end and not merely as a mean. Those are Immanuel Kant's words. A means, not means. So exploitation could be pursued in accompanied with dignity, perhaps. I'm a little aware of the time. You got to.
We started a bit late, so that's okay.
Okay, good, because I think I'll make it reasonably here.
Yeah.
All right, what if the peer ETI are peaceful, not particularly warlike? What obtains at that particular point? Well, then I think we could think about principles of justice, which of course presuppose dignity. It's so much easier to have justice in peacetime than war. I don't know if you've noticed that. But definitely exploitation here would become commerce. It would be voluntary, and hopefully for the edification and profit of all parties, rather than exploitation, which tends to be simply a one-way pattern. Now I want to go on to what becomes a little bit more. Wait a minute, before I do that, now we have to deal with a little bit of theology. Stephen Hawking is a theologian, even though he denies it. Stephen Hawking says to the SETI people, if they call, don't answer. Well, why does he say that? He says because they're going to be like us. They're going to be militaristic, they're going to want to conquer us, and they're going to want to take us over. And so what we should do here on Earth is just hide in obscurity so they won't find us. And after all, and his argument is, look what the white Europeans did to the Native Americans. Virtual genocide. So Hawking has sort of made up his mind that they're going to be hostile, but note what his anthropology is. We're hostile, and if they're like us, they're really going to be dangerous. My colleague Bob Russell in Berkeley, and some of you know Bob, is a physicist, and one of the interesting things in Bob's thought is he likes to ground human nature in our biology and then further into the physics that supports the biology. So when he takes a look at human sinfulness, for example, he wants to see how there are physical contributions from biological evolution, and that actually is grounded in entropy and other kinds of issues in physics. So with that kind of an anthropology at work, he's saying if, according to the principle of mediocrity, that the same physics and the same biology is at work on another planet, they're going to turn out a lot like us. I predict that when we finally make contact with life in the universe, it will be a lot like us, seeking the good, beset by failures, and open to the grace of forgiveness and new life that God offers all God's creatures. Well, the theological word for this is ambiguity. Okay, now let's turn to my final category, intelligent beings in outer space who might be superior to us. And if Carl Sagan and SETI people are right, really superior to us, what happens then? Will they be more intelligent? Well, that's an assumption, but here's the tricky one. Are they going to be more virtuous? Does increased intelligence automatically lead to increased virtue? Well, almost every Christian theologian will say, heck no. More intelligent you are, the more damage you can do, actually. Okay, let's go back to Frank Drake. Now the issue gets kind of subtle. And I like Frank, he's a great guy. And he's sort of the philosopher of SETI. And remember assumption number 2 that I made amongst the astrobiologists. He's interviewed here, and Frank is saying everything we know says there are other civilizations out there to be found. Now just pause. Any empirical evidence? 0, right? The discovery of such civilizations would enrich our civilization with valuable information. Now just pause for a minute. Remember what I said earlier, distinguishing the UFO phenomenon from SETI. The UFO phenomenon would say we can talk to them. SETI says we'll be talking through radio communication. All right? So that means they're going to send us information. Oh, here we go. We will get from them information about science, technology, and sociology. What does he mean by that? This information could directly improve our abilities to conserve and to deal with sociological problems. Wait a minute, I thought that intelligence led to increased technology, but now we're going to deal with sociological problems such as poverty. How about that? Cheap energy, potential, and finally advancements in medicine. I call this the celestial savior model of ETI. Again, 0 empirical evidence. You've got evolutionary biologists against you, yet what we are going to get from the sky are solutions to our ecological problems, our problems of poverty, advances in medicine and health. Now, I would like to believe that all of this is true. And in fact, believing that it could be true is enough to launch an expensive scientific experiment to try to prove it. But what I want to emphasize is we've got an enormous set of assumptions here. And what's hidden in the assumptions is not just that salvation will come from the sky, but it'll come from science. In some ways, we've already decided that science saves on Earth, so extraterrestrial science would even be more salvific than science on Earth has been. Okay, let's run this scenario. Okay, so we have superior ETI who are hostile. Would we have to impute dignity to them? Well, if we use the criteria of St. Thomas Aquinas or Immanuel Kant, yes, we would, because they're reasonable. Now, suppose we try to protect Earth, but we're just bowled over, and we get enslaved. Are there any slave moralities available? Well, yes, there is. There's one in the Bible. Slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. Did I spoil your day? Well, it's right there in the Bible, and one of the reasons that you and I don't think about a slave morality is because we've had the Enlightenment, in which the doctrine of human dignity says we're all equal and there is no one who deserves to be our master. But I think we're going to have to confront, possibly, a different moral situation. Okay, what if they're just plain peaceful? Well, chances are it'll look a lot like our relationship to ETI, who are our peers. But what if they are salvific? What if Frank Drake's dreams come true? Well, we're more than likely going to be willing to impute dignity. We'll certainly want commerce. And if they do solve our poverty problem, solve our energy problem, and advance our medicine, we'll probably think that gratitude is something that we owe them. Now, there's a big question about how realistic there is, and I've tried to show you all the cautions we need. Yet, it is a period of time in which these assumptions being made by people who are poking around with space exploration need to be teased out and some ethical and moral scenarios drawn. Now, if they're really going to be salvific, we can come up with a new religion, right? Good news, they found water on the moon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. I don't know, this last slide is a sort of leaning Tower of Pisa, except it's the Houses of Parliament in London. I was slightly worried about that one, but anyway, that's something different. Okay, over to you for questions. I'm going to actually ask, I'm going to ask a question first, I think it's tonight. Just to come back to Francisco Ayala, and I think his point was really picked up a little bit by Bob Russell. But of course, Francisco is one end of the spectrum, isn't he? In saying that if we replay the tape of life again, it's very unlikely that this would happen. So he's sort of with Stephen Jay Gould on that particular issue. Of course, there are people like Simon Conway Morris here in Cambridge, as you probably know, who would take a completely opposite view, that if we replay the type of life again, it's almost inevitable that things will work out something that looks a bit like what we have here. So I just wanted to put that in as well to balance off Francisco's point and to illustrate the fact that biologists as well don't really agree about these things. So yeah.
No, that's an important observation. And if I were Frank Drake and I wanted to pick the biologist to be on my team, I'd want Simon Conway Morris to be on my team and not Francisco Ayala. But I think that just shows that we're dealing with an assumption here, and as important as that assumption is, the issue is really a debatable one, and it's not as solid a foundation for launching a research program as one might hope for.
Over to your questions, please. Yes.
Yes, going right back to the start of your lecture, you're talking about people going to the moon and geoengineering and so on. There's something called the Antarctic Treaty.
The Antarctic Treaty? Go ahead.
Which governs what you can do in the Antarctic. You can't introduce alien species, for instance, therefore your dog sledges have gone.
Right.
Do we not need, first of all, to decide who actually owns these planetary bodies and what you can do? Because they're not owned by NASA. I mean, President might be very happy to see American companies exploit them. But just supposing, there was Chinese companies, and the Chinese were calling the shots, would you be quite so happy? You know, while these issues don't exist, do we not need to actually settle them?
Right.
set them international law. Because I guess also commercial companies won't be too happy going to the moon if you can't own a piece of the moon. So that's going to be difficult.
Right. With regard to the Antarctica, both Chris McKay and Margaret Race, whose pictures I showed you, really believe that the treaty regarding Antarctica is a good model for a new treaty that we need to have through the United Nations regarding extraterrestrial real estate. Chris McKay actually spends a number of months per year in Antarctica with an international research team, both taking advantage of the treaty as well as subjecting potential astronauts or space visitors to very harsh environments, which the environment of Mars is going to be. So the Antarctic Treaty is generally agreed on as a good model, but the world really needs a new space treaty that's more recent than 1967. What I think is the hidden issue and I haven't quite gotten this sorted out, so I lack a little bit of clarity, is that up until recently we could assume that the only one who's going to land on the moon or land on Mars is going to be a scientist funded by a government somewhere. And then scientists can do what scientists do and love to do. But now that the private sector is investing large amounts of money to get there, and state-funded programs are diminishing in size, if I were a scientist, I'd think, hey, I might lose this race. Maybe we should get some principles in place, because right now there are none. It's like the Wild West, and the cowboys can go and do anything they want. There really is no regulation in place with regard to mining asteroids, with regard to tourism on the moon and things of that particular nature. So the ethicist in me says, okay, so we've got these two competing interests, the scientific interest, we've got the commercial interests, and should we come up with policies that just sort of keep them from sacrificing each other, or are there deeper philosophical issues such as, is there an intrinsic value to the moon's environment or to Mars' environment, and that it needs to be treated in a certain respectful way by both the scientists and the tourist agencies. Some people have suggested a national park model. Well, you know, those things get corrupted by whatever regime happens to be in power. So I don't know here, but like I said, I think now we've got competing parties in a way that we didn't have before, and I would hate to think that ethics is only a stopgap. It'd be nice if ethics could be anticipatory and future-oriented before you get the actual shootout on the surface of Mars between the scientists and the tourists, or the colonizers.
Well, I think NASA is assuming that the commercial world will now pay for taking people up to the space station.
Oh yeah, I'm volunteering to be the first one to go. But
if you can do that, it's only a short step to go into the moon, to be honest.
Yeah. Now, it might not happen in the next 5 years, but I mean, there's no reason why we can't think decades down the line.
Okay, we're going to go here and then here. Thank you.
In relation to this question, there are actually a few more treaties about it, but they're more implicit. For example, various treaties between Russia and the United States about arms in space, but also the treaty about aerospace jurisdiction. There's an article about outer space in it, and it basically treats it as the high seas. So wouldn't it be logical that most states view space as the high seas and also use the same laws which apply to the high seas?
I'm not a jurist, but I suspect that just the kind of logic you're describing would probably take place as policy policies get formulated. I have a story. Do we have time for a story?
Yeah, we've always got time for stories.
Despite the agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union, if you may remember, when President Reagan was in office in the United States, he created this image of Star Wars, where he was going to weaponize space with lasers and fire lasers against Soviet rocketry. And this was a big deal. I don't, were you born then? Anyway. And a clear violation of even the spirit of the 1967 treaty and certainly what was going on with the Soviet Union. And we mentioned Charlie Towns' name earlier today, who's the inventor of the laser. And I was having coffee with Charlie one time and talking about the laser, and he said that he had a chance to talk with President Reagan about Star Wars. And he said, Mr. President, I'm the inventor of the laser. I know what lasers can do and can't do. And he says, there is no way you could shoot down a rocket with a laser. So do you know something about the technology that I don't know? And Reagan said, no. He says, it's all a smokescreen to scare the Soviets.
Yes, down there.
So I had a question, and
Yeah.
perhaps it's a very silly question, but it has to do with the planetary protection ethics. I think that's the
Yes.
mission it is. So one worry that was raised is this space junk.
Space junk.
Now, it seems to me that there's another problem, and I always felt, well, it might be a genuine problem here. So, with supposedly interstellar travel, so the mass of the Earth will be reduced a weedy bit. You know, every rocket that sends off, you know,
Yeah.
takes off.
The Earth gets smaller.
Well, the Earth loses mass, and therefore gets well, right? Gravity works in a different way, so the Earth will be attracted by the sun more quickly, and so it will have all kinds of. So is this just physics ignoramus talk, or is it when it takes some sort of a big flight? Is it a real problem?
Oh, is it a real problem? Well, maybe
Maybe the physicists should.
we have an astrophysicist here somewhere. Yeah. Can you speak to this?
Well, the short answer is don't worry too much. The elaborate answer, I won't make it too elaborate, is first of all the relative mass of what you're sending out compared to the mass of the Earth is negligibly small, extremely small. You would have to be sending rockets at the rate of, I don't know, 100 a day for 1 million years or something. I'm just shooting out numbers for you to make a dent to the mass of the Earth. Now, secondly, the mass of the Earth has absolutely nothing to do with the orbit of the Earth. The orbit of the Earth is completely determined. The orbit of anything is completely determined by the central object, in this case the Sun, and the distance to the object. So if you remove the Earth, put the Moon, or put Jupiter, it would still take the same orbit, it would still take the same time to orbit. So that's not a problem. The only problem that could occur if you reduce the mass of the Earth significantly is the atmosphere, because then you'd have less gravity to retain the gases, and then the gases might start to fly off, or you start to have a different composition because the heavier gases are only the ones that stick around and things like this. But that would be in a billion years or something, so there's nothing to worry now.
Long-term worry. I think we'll make this. Yes, please. Yes.
I would like to ask about anthropocentric fallacy, because when we presume that we can contact with aliens or someone, we tend to forget that all our technology is fit to our anatomy by laws of ergonomy and so on, and also about the language and body language. That, for example, if I meet men even from other culture on our planet, if I do gesture like that, he may look on my finger and not what I'm pointing at.
Right.
And so on and so forth. And there is a problem in learning even the spoken language, not having any comparison with other similar languages, and so on. And maybe aliens, if they exist, maybe they're communicating by, I don't know, like bats or whales or something. And do people from SETI, I'm wondering if they have answers to the problems.
Well, if I understand the question correctly, under the label anthropocentric fallacy, we need to understand that what we consider human intelligence to be inextricably connected to our bodies and our physical situation. And I really think that's demonstrably true, what your assumption is. So we would want to ask Frank Drake whether or not he expects the same kind of intelligence that would be grounded in the same kind of physical being. I actually don't know what his answer would be, but that would be a very good question. And which reminds me of another story. Ian, do you know the people in the robotics lab at MIT? If I understand it right, in the robotics lab at MIT, where they were trying to make thinking robots, save all the intermediate steps, but they finally put computers in the extensions of these robots that would learn things. And intelligence wasn't grounded solely in the computer up here, but there could be intelligence in the sense of learning in the extremities. And I've often noticed with expert piano players, they can be playing beautiful music and then talk to you. Well, there's an intelligence in those fingers of a sort. And I think that you and I associate intelligence with our brains, probably for good reason, but I appreciate your assumption. I think intelligence goes throughout our body, and it's not just a disembodied brain. So how that would affect the assumptions being made in space exploration, I'm not too sure, but it certainly ought not to be overlooked. And Carl Sagan used to say, we can't really expect creatures on another planet to have our anatomy. They could have evolved quite differently and still be intelligent. Well, what does that mean in light of your question? And I don't know the answer. Good question.
Okay, well, dinner is approaching, but we will have the opportunity to have lots more questions later on. First of all, let's thank Ted for stretching our minds into that.